Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about qualitative data so that you have a better understanding of how to read it and talk about it when you write a paper. Qualitative data is information that is gathered from people to provide insight into their experiences. Qualitative data is trying to ask about the why and the how and in what way people feel about things. It is not trying to understand how much or how frequently things are happening. That is more accurately and effectively captured by quantitative data, numerical data. Qualitative data uses descriptions and word categories called themes to study human experiences and the realities from the participant's perspective. Qualitative data is highly subjective. That's really its purpose, because the goal is to understand what's going on from the viewpoint of the participants with institutional, social context intact. And qualitative data can't be quantified, it can't be put into numerical terms, but it does provide a deeper dive into the information than you can get from just looking at numbers. When we look at the different ways that people conduct research, it's generally grouped into three categories. You have qualitative research, which we're talking about right now. We have quantitative research, which is kind of considered the opposite. And then there's mixed methods. So qualitative research, it shows up as researchers conducting interviews, conducting focus groups, conducting observations, asking open-ended questions on questionnaires, and reviewing secondary narrative data like books that have already been written, looking at what website text, diary, extracts, social media, etc. Quantitative research, on the other hand, is looking for the numbers. And so that is typically showing up as surveys that people are conducting, experiments that people are conducting, meta-analysis, which is pulling a bunch of different data sets together and looking for trends, and manipulation, general manipulation of numerical data. And then mixed methods is a combination of the two. And you might see that sometimes, particularly in longer research articles, that they have looked at both types of research. Here we have some quick examples of qualitative data in publications. And so we have the American Journal of Infection Control doing a qualitative study, and another study here, and another study. And these are often using observation or interviewing or open-ended questions on surveys to collect the data that they need to explain the experiences that these people have that is creating some kind of finding for the researcher. Those publications often have a very consistent format for sharing the information, and it generally happens in 6 parts and an abstract. So an abstract is just a one-paragraph summary of the entire article or book, and it's a great place to start when you're doing research to make sure that this is a source that will be useful to you when you're writing a paper. But you do have to read at least some of the actual article and book to pull information for your essay. What follows the abstract is the introduction, or very rarely called background. And this is where the author of the article or book will provide you with their topic and some introductory background information relevant to the topic. And they will include their research question or questions, where they are saying this is what we're studying, phrased as one or multiple questions, and they're trying to get answers to those questions. What comes next is the literature review, which is a overview of what other people have already found, so what they've already published. And the author of the article or book that you're reading will summarize, paraphrase, and dig into what other people have already found related to their topic. The third section will be the method or the methodology. which is basically where they tell you what their method was for collecting this data. And so in a qualitative article or book, they will usually explain if they're conducting interviews or focus groups or observations or some combination to gather the data. They'll talk about their sample size, how many people they're talking to. They'll talk about their population, etc. The fourth section is the results section, and that is where the data that is collected is shared. And it's fairly raw data, just being presented to the reader of the article or the book, saying, here, look at this information that we found. So it often contains quotes and descriptive observations or excerpts of already published work that is shared with the reader. And the last one is the discussion and or conclusion section, which is where the authors are considering the results and turning that into their findings. So what the data actually means. And you can see there's an asterisk by abstract, introduction, and discussion. These are generally the most useful pieces for undergraduate students in doing research for their essays. So obviously the abstract is important to read while you're doing your research to make sure that it's an applicable topic for your essay. Then the introduction provides a lot of good, fairly plain language information about the topic and the context. And then the discussion is where they pull it all together for you and explain, hopefully in fairly plain language, what it all means. So it is really important to know that the authors of these articles and books have picked the right kind of study for the question that they want to answer. So we're going to take a look at some research questions and see that they can be qualitative in nature or quantitative in nature. And if it's qualitative, you want to do a qualitative study, and if it's quantitative, you want to do a quantitative study. So the first question here, in what ways are the grieving experiences of older adults different from younger adults? And because you're asking in what ways and trying to delve into the experiences, this is a qualitative question, and it would be best supported by qualitative data, such as interviewing older and younger adults. Next question, how effectively does high school GPA predict college success? How effectively is looking for a number, numerical data, so this would be at best a quantitative study. How frequently do millennials change jobs? Again, how frequently, looking for a number, quantitative. How do temporary workers who want to be full-time feel about temporary labor appointments? This is asking about how people are feeling, so qualitative. And what are the experiences of young adults who have quit high school and transitioned into adult basic education programs? Because you're asking what the experiences are, you are looking more at a qualitative study. How satisfied are employees with their jobs? Looking for numerical satisfaction data. That would be quantitative. In what ways does leadership impact productivity? Again, looking for in what ways something is happening. When or how often do employees want performance feedback? So you're looking at when, timing-wise, or how often, numerical-wise, which is quantitative data. Which leadership style is preferred by government workers? You're looking at ranking, so you're looking at numerical data. And then finally, why do third sector organizations hire transformational leaders more frequently than public sector organizations? And you're looking for the why behind something, so that is qualitative. Now let's take a look at some of the types of qualitative research and the data that it collects. So the first one here is very common, and that is conducting interviews. So the researcher will do one-on-one question and answer sessions where they will collect information from one person at a time. Sometimes this is unstructured, where they don't go in with any specific questions. Sometimes it's semi-structured, where some questions are planned ahead and some are off the cuff, extemporaneous. And sometimes they are structured interviews where everything is planned out ahead of time. And the benefits of interviews is that it allows the researcher to ask follow-up questions and for clarification. So it's more easily made into a dialogue when needed. But it is time consuming in that you're gathering data one person at a time, and often interviews are 30 minutes to 1 hour at a time or longer, or requiring multiple sessions per person. Now we'll take a look at focus groups, which is similar to interviews, but instead of a one-to-one session, you have a small group answering questions. And usually that group is 5 to 12 participants in size. Any smaller, and it gets difficult for them to really answer the way a focus group benefits from answering, and any larger and it gets too unwieldy, and people just kind of scratch the surface with their answers or don't participate at all. It is a facilitated discussion where participants are encouraged to respond to each other. So instead of just the interviewer asking one person and back and forth, participants are encouraged to respond, build upon, disagree with, etc., what other participants are saying. This can cause some privacy concerns. So you may have people who won't share because they're concerned that it's being said in front of other people. Individuals may not contribute at all if they're not comfortable or they don't want to, or they don't feel they have to because there's so many other people. Or individuals might over-contribute and really run the show and not let other people jump in as they should. And focus groups are a great alternative, but you're really focusing on the breadth of information. You're getting a lot more information that is higher level compared to interviews that go much more in depth with one person at a time. Next, let's talk about observation. So observation has two primary categories. There's participant observation, where the researcher is part of the group that is being studied. The advantages are that they have extra insight into what's going on. It's a lot more flexible, and they have better access to groups that might be suspicious of being observed. Some disadvantages is that it can cause ethical dilemmas because you're part of the group, you're interacting with the group that you are studying. The other type of observation, which is more common, is non-participant observation, where the researcher is an outsider. There is little to no participation with the group, and they're just there to see what's happening, observe what's happening. The advantages are that there's less bias, less attachment, and it's quicker. And disadvantages would be that you have what's called the observer effect. So the act of observing somebody or a group changes their behavior. They might be too distant, they might be missing things, or because they're not part of the group, they're not interacting with them, they don't understand the social conventions, they may be making incorrect assumptions about people's behavior. Another type of qualitative data is the open answer questionnaire, or open-ended questions that may be part of a numerical survey. These open-ended questions, because they look like survey questions that are more commonly seeking numerical data, do sometimes get confused with quantitative data. But when you have an open-ended question, you're expecting people to write answers in response. So it is qualitative, not numerical. So you're looking for multiple words or a longer narrative response. Drawbacks here is that you can't ask follow-up questions or for clarification in the moment when people are filling out the questionnaires or questions, or at all if you don't ask for contact information as part of the questionnaire. Some example of open-ended questions that are not a yes/no or a rate this 1 through 5, for example, are what do you enjoy about your job? And you could get any number of responses of description from people. What do you not enjoy about your job? What interests do you share with your coworkers? How do you delegate work tasks? And we're going to talk a little bit about sampling here, which is the idea that in any type of research, you can't talk to everybody usually because the population is too big. So the population is the entire group that you want to study. So for example, if you wanted to study students in a college setting, your entire population would be students. Your population would not include teachers, although they're in the same environment. That's a different population, a different group. And when you see population, the whole, represented in writing, in articles and publications, it's usually a capital N that is used for shorthand to mean the whole population. The sample is the number of people from the population that are being studied. So the number of people being interviewed, the number of people being observed, and so on. And in the publications, it will be a lowercase n that represents the sample. So population, capital N, you'll see capital N equals 5,620, lowercase n equals 12, for example. So you got a large, over 5,000 person population and a small sample size of just 12 people. Unlike with quantitative data, you can just have a small sample for qualitative data because it is quality, not quantity, for the qualitative data. So some popular sampling methods that you'll see for qualitative data, they are non-probability sampling. What this means is that the findings that you get from the author are not generalizable to the entire population. So if only 12 people out of over 5,000 of the population are interviewed, you can't say everybody in the population feels that way. That is actually the goal of quantitative data, where you want as many people as possible responding. Popular types of sampling methods for qualitative data that you'll see in articles is convenience sampling, which just means people that are convenient to the researcher. So they might be geographically closer and easier to reach, or they may have some way of more easily accessing these people. So we call it convenient sampling. Purposeful or stratified sampling means that you're picking one particular portion of the population and very carefully picking them due to their demographics. So for example, looking at employees in their first year of employment. So not all employees, just those that are currently in their first year of employment. And the other really popular one is snowball sampling, which is where you start with one person and you say, do you know anybody else who I could talk to? And they have maybe 3 people. And then you talk to those 3 people and you say, oh, do you know anybody else I could talk to? So the metaphor here is like a small snowball starting at the top of the hill. When you roll it down the hill in cartoons, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, picking up more snow, more snow, more snow. That is the metaphor for that one. So the concept of saturation is how researchers know when to stop. So they need to stop at some point collecting data so that they can move on. And they want to make sure that they're getting good data and enough of it to be able to find their conclusions. And for qualitative data, saturation is when there are no new things being heard. So no new concepts, no new themes are being heard when they're interviewing or using focus groups or when they're observing. And functionally, it's when researchers start hearing the same things repeated over and over again. So that's why very often with qualitative data, for interviews in particular, you'll have very small sample sizes of 4, 6, maybe 10 people. And that is the point when they've started to hear the same things being repeated, so they end their data collection process. As a rule of thumb, if you are conducting interviews, if you can, interview 6 to 8 people, you're going to find 80% of the ideas from the data that you can. If you interview 12 to 20 people, you're going to find 90% or more of the ideas. For focus groups, again, of the average of 5 to 12 participants, if you have 2 to 3 focus group sessions, you'll hear about 80% of the things that you would be wanting to hear before you reach saturation. And if you conducted 4 to 6 sessions, you would hear about 90%. For observation, you really just need to continue observing until you witness what you need to witness, and there's no new information coming in. So once all the information is gathered, the researchers then need to analyze what it means. So it doesn't matter if it's an interview, focus group, observation, they still need to take all that information and say, okay, what does this actually mean? And so we call this QDA, or qualitative data analysis. And it's when you put a descriptive label with a concept that you're seeing in a much longer text or description. And there's a couple types of coding that you may hear people talk about. Open coding is usually the most popular, and that is where the researcher is finding the codes while they are analyzing the text. And closed coding means that the researcher is bringing with them their preconceived codes, their terms that they're going to be looking for when they look through their data. So here's an example of that happening. You've got a text response here. The interviewer asked, what in this course has helped you the most? You have the response here. You have, for example, 10 interviews that were conducted, and each one was an hour long. There would be so much text for you to go through. So what researchers do is they do a 1 to 2 step process where they start summarizing what they've found and eventually end up with codes, 1 to 3 word phrases that represent chunks of the text, because that's much easier to manage. But you do, of course, lose content and context when you do that. But you will see researchers talking about their codes, how often codes were occurring. This is what they're referring to, that they were looking at a bigger chunk of text and they found references to those topics, which we call codes or themes. And here's what qualitative data will look like in publications. We have 2 examples here. The first one is some quote being put into a sentence within a paragraph. And so you see where the quote begins, you have people saying, I feel safe, I haven't felt threatened, there's not a lot of violence around here. And then the second example here is also quote, but when you have a longer chunk of text, you need to pull it out and not use quotation marks. Instead, you use what's called block quote format. And so when researchers are writing up their findings, if they need to provide a longer chunk from their interviews or observations, they will do it and it will look like this, which is a block quote. So when researchers are talking about their methodology and then showing you the results and then telling you what they found in their discussion or conclusion, part of that is that they are telling you what they are seeing from the interview, the focus group, or the observation. So it does require analysis and interpretation from the researcher, and it's not quite as clear-cut as it is with quantitative data where you're getting numbers that you can use. You're looking at text, so it's not quite as clear-cut how accurate their analysis is. So what they sometimes do is talk about intercoder reliability, which is where they have two or more coders, two or more people looking at the text and saying that they have a certain percentage of matching codes or analysis. So that's trying to get you to be more comfortable with their analysis and interpretation. They also use triangulation, which means that they're comparing their findings to other things. That might be quantitative data, it might be documents, observation, written or oral histories, etc. And they're trying to triangulate their findings to make sure it's accurate across the different types of data. And they have member checking as another way to make sure that their information is accurate. And that's when they ask participants to review possibly the transcripts, the coding, and or their actual findings before publishing it and making it available to everyone. And you will often see them displaying raw data like text or quotes, tables, and diagrams to show how they are analyzing the data to come to these conclusions. And while there are a lot of challenges and concerns about qualitative data is really important. It is not as popular as quantitative data, and it is not as frequently used because people have concerns about its validity and so on. But again, qualitative data is doing something different than quantitative data. You're looking for the experiences, the why, and not the how much. So there are concerns about, is the methodology the right approach for what they're trying to study? So again, back to those questions, is it a quantitative question or a qualitative question? There are concerns about sampling techniques, particularly convenience sampling and snowball sampling, which has a lot to do with convenience and who's around that's easily accessible to interview or observe. Researchers also can ask bad or leading questions, which makes the data irrelevant or incorrect. Researchers can also have a bunch of assumptions or biases that they bring to the topic and the research. However, most of researchers these days will actually acknowledge their biases within the article, sometimes called delimitations. So you may see them saying what their potential problems are as being a researcher on this topic, and they will then try to mitigate their assumptions and their biases. There's also concern about poor analysis and synthesis, coding, and theming of the data. So it is less obvious compared to quantitative data, where people can use formulas to show how they're arriving at certain pieces of information. The analysis of the data is not as clear in qualitative research. And then finally, poor use of results in publication. Sometimes they pick results that do not match what they're trying to show and so on when they're writing articles and books. So those are all